Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story about a young student who entered a marriage with a wealthy woman, and what happened next left him completely shocked. Mark Davis trudged along the slick, rain-soaked streets of a small college town in Texas. His backpack weighed heavy on his shoulder, a symbol of the debts he had inherited after his father's passing. At 23, he was barely hanging on, juggling his last year of law school with a part-time job, struggling to keep his head above water. The world seemed to be closing in on him, and every step felt like one step closer to a dead end. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He answered it, his voice stiff and tired. "Mark Davis, speaking," he said. A composed, authoritative voice responded. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you regarding your financial situation." Mark frowned, confusion clouding his mind. "I'm sorry, who are you? How do you know about?" "I know enough," she interrupted smoothly. "Let's meet at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Mark could protest. He stood there for a moment, staring at his phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend like the call never happened. But another part of him, the part that was running out of options, knew he had no choice. He was desperate. He couldn't afford to turn down a meeting with someone who might help him out of the mess he was in. Later that evening, Mark arrived at the bistro. The rain had soaked through his jacket, and he was already feeling the weight of the evening's uncertainty. As he stepped inside, the warm lighting and smell of fresh coffee greeted him. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on a woman sitting alone at a corner table. She was older, dressed impeccably, with silver hair styled perfectly, exuding an aura of quiet power. "Mark Davis?" she asked as he approached. Her voice was calm and inviting, but there was something sharp about her tone, something that told him she wasn't used to being turned down. He nodded and sat down, still unsure of what to expect. "I know about your situation, Mark. Your father's debts. The bills piling up. You're running out of time." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wondering how much this woman actually knew about him. She had been right, his life was a mess. But what did she want from him? "What are you offering?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm offering you a solution. A business arrangement. Marry me." Mark blinked, sure he had misheard her. "Marry you," he echoed, his mind racing. "Why would you want to marry me?" She leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes locking with his. "You're young. You're unattached. And you're desperate enough to consider this." Mark felt his chest tighten. He had nothing left to lose, but this was absurd. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What's in it for you?" Her expression softened, but only just. "I have no family, Mark. No children, no heirs. I need someone to secure my legacy. Someone I can trust. Think of it as a contract. A marriage of convenience." Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't do this," he muttered, shaking his head. "I need time to think." She didn't seem bothered by his reaction. "Of course. But don't take too long. The offer won't be on the table forever." With that, Mark left, his mind racing. He had never felt so torn in his life. Was he really considering marrying a woman he didn't know just to save himself from financial ruin? And yet, a part of him couldn't shake the thought that he might not have another choice. As he walked home in the rain, the weight of his situation hung heavy on his shoulders. He had a decision to make, but no matter what choice he made, his life was about to change forever. Mark walked slowly through the rain, the cold seeping through his jacket as he made his way back home. His mind raced with Eleanor's words echoing in his ears. "Marry me," she had said. The idea felt absurd, but at the same time, it lingered in his thoughts, gnawing at him. What was he supposed to do? He had nothing left. His father's debts, his future, his very life seemed like a sinking ship. He couldn't let everything fall apart now, not when this offer was staring him in the face. As he opened the door to his small apartment, the smell of cold coffee and old papers greeted him. He dropped his backpack on the floor and sat down on the worn-out couch. His eyes drifted to the old family photos on the wall: his mother, his father, his little sister. How had things gone so wrong? He hadn't even had time to mourn his father properly, let alone think about his future. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from his mother. "Have you heard from your sister? She's getting worried about you." Mark sighed. His sister was always the optimist, always trying to keep things together. But even she couldn't fix the mess they were in. He stared at the screen, wondering if he should reply. But the reality of his situation was too overwhelming. How could he explain to her that he was considering marrying a woman he didn't even know, just to get out of debt? He could almost hear her disappointment, the way she'd scold him for not thinking of another way. But there was no other way. He had to act fast. That night, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the rain tapping gently against the window. The hours passed, but sleep wouldn't come. He kept thinking about Eleanor. She had been so calm, so sure of herself. And yet, there had been a softness in her eyes, a vulnerability he hadn't expected. Could he trust her? Could he trust anyone? By the time the sun rose, Mark had made up his mind. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped by his debts, his failures, his regrets. Eleanor's offer was a lifeline, no matter how unconventional it seemed. If it meant securing his future, if it meant getting his life back on track, maybe he was willing to take the risk. Mark stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. He didn't look like the man he had been just a year ago. The weight of the decision he had made felt heavy, but there was no turning back now. He had to meet Eleanor again. As he arrived at Brooks' Bistro, he felt a wave of nervous energy wash over him. The restaurant was quiet, the perfect setting for a private conversation. He spotted Eleanor immediately, sitting at the same corner table where they had met the night before. She looked just as composed as before, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if she were in control of everything around her. Mark hesitated for a moment before walking up to her. Eleanor looked up as he approached, her lips curling into a slight smile. "You've made your decision?" she asked, her voice steady, almost businesslike. Mark nodded. "I'm in," he said, his voice low but certain. "I'll marry you." Eleanor didn't smile, but there was a flicker of approval in her eyes. She nodded once and stood up, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she moved to shake his hand. "Good," she said, her voice colder now. "We'll set up the paperwork immediately." Mark felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The decision had been made, and yet, something deep inside him felt uneasy. Was he really doing the right thing? Was he making the biggest mistake of his life? But as Eleanor led him to the back office, where they would finalize everything, Mark realized that this was more than just a business deal for him. It was a chance to escape, a chance to start over, even if it meant losing himself in the process. As they sat down at the desk, Eleanor pushed a thick stack of papers toward him. Mark glanced at the contract, the terms already outlined. It felt so clinical, so detached from the reality of what this decision meant. But it was his only option. "You'll sign here," Eleanor instructed, pointing to the line at the bottom of the page. Mark picked up the pen and hesitated for just a moment, staring at the words in front of him. This was it. The moment that would change everything. He signed. And just like that, his life was no longer his own. Mark sat at the small desk in Eleanor's office, the weight of the contract heavy in his hands. The signature he had just signed felt like a finality, a point of no return. As Eleanor stood by the window, looking out over the city, Mark's mind wandered back to the life he had left behind, the small apartment, his father's debts, his mother's worried face. This deal, this marriage, it was his way out. Or at least, that's what he kept telling himself. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. He had agreed to marry a woman he barely knew, for reasons he still didn't fully understand. Eleanor wasn't just rich, she was powerful, in a way that made him feel small. She didn't need him, not in the way a person needs love or companionship. This was business. Nothing more. Eleanor turned from the window and caught Mark's gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel like an object, a means to an end. She walked over to the desk and sat down across from him, the chair creaking under her weight. "Now that the formalities are done, we can move forward," she said, her voice calm, measured. "I'll introduce you to my associates tomorrow. We have some work to do before the wedding. I'll be arranging everything: venue, guests, contracts. It will be seamless. Just stay out of the spotlight for now, and keep up appearances." Mark nodded, his throat tight. He had no idea what he was stepping into, but there was no turning back now. He had to play his part, at least for the time being. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and preparations. Eleanor was efficient, and everything was arranged with cold precision. Mark, on the other hand, felt like a bystander in his own life. He was constantly on edge, trying to figure out where he fit into this strange new world that Eleanor inhabited. It felt like he was living in someone else's life, playing a role he wasn't ready for. One evening, Eleanor called him into her study. Mark had been avoiding her as much as possible, still trying to adjust to the whirlwind of changes that had come with signing the contract. But this time, he couldn't avoid her. She had something to say. "I know you're nervous," Eleanor said, looking at him over the rim of her glass of wine. "This is a big step for both of us. But it's important that you understand something. This is not just a marriage. It's a partnership. You'll be representing my interests, my name. The wedding is just the beginning. After that, we'll make sure everything is in place. You will be taken care of, and so will your family." Mark didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how he felt about what she was saying. Was this really what he had signed up for? A partnership, yes, but was it truly about mutual respect? Or was it simply about power, control, and convenience? He took a deep breath and finally spoke. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "But, Eleanor, I need to know what this means for me. I need to understand my role here. What do you want from me?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. She set her glass down on the table and leaned forward slightly. "What I want from you is simple," she said. "I want you to be loyal, to be present, and to do your part. You may not understand the full scope of this right now, but you will. In time, you will see that this is the only way for both of us to succeed." Mark nodded again, though he still wasn't sure if he believed her. He wanted to trust her, to believe that this wasn't just a transaction, but the reality was staring him in the face. This was a business deal. A deal that involved his life, his future, and everything he had worked for. And yet, something told him that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than just a contract. The next few weeks flew by. The wedding was just days away, and Mark had barely had time to catch his breath. Every day was a whirlwind of finalizing details, making appearances, and keeping up with the charade. He had to smile for the cameras, play the part of the eager, loving fiancé, all while his mind was constantly running. As the wedding day approached, Mark couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. Was he really ready for this? Ready for a life where his every move would be scrutinized, where the lines between reality and performance were blurred? And yet, deep down, he knew one thing for sure: he had no choice. He had committed, and there was no turning back now. Eleanor's world was one he was stuck in, whether he liked it or not. And the only thing left to do was play his part, as perfectly as he could. The wedding day arrived sooner than Mark had expected. The grand hall was decorated with towering flowers, golden accents, and shimmering lights that gave it an almost otherworldly glow. Guests arrived in waves, dressed in their finest attire, their voices blending into a symphony of chatter and laughter. Mark stood at the entrance, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but the nerves in his stomach wouldn't settle. He felt like an actor, playing a role he wasn't prepared for. Eleanor stood nearby, calm and composed, as always, her eyes scanning the room, making sure everything was perfect. She glanced at Mark, giving him a brief but reassuring smile. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked, her voice smooth and controlled, though Mark could detect a hint of something else, something soft, something almost human, hidden beneath her usual mask. Mark nodded, though the unease in his chest didn't dissipate. He wasn't sure what this would be, whether it would be a real marriage or just another business transaction, but what he did know was that this moment was going to define the rest of his life. As they walked toward the altar, Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. The eyes of the guests, the cameras, the whispers, they were all focused on them. He glanced at Eleanor, who walked beside him with an air of quiet confidence. She was stunning, as always, but there was something about her that unsettled him. Was she thinking about this like he was? A deal? A transaction? Or was there something more? The ceremony was brief. The officiant spoke the traditional words, but Mark's mind kept drifting. Eleanor's words echoed in his head, "This is a partnership. Stay loyal. Play your part." And that's what he was doing, playing his part. But as the rings were exchanged, and the vows spoken, a small voice inside him whispered that this was not the life he had imagined. Could he really keep pretending? They shared a quick, polite kiss at the altar, and just like that, the deed was done. The guests clapped, the photographer clicked his camera, and the reality of the moment began to sink in. Eleanor turned to Mark, her smile brief but genuine, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Was this how it was supposed to feel? The reception was nothing short of extravagant. Music played softly in the background as people mingled, raising glasses and exchanging pleasantries. Mark felt out of place, surrounded by the elite, their conversations about investments, luxury vacations, and private estates. It was a world he had never truly belonged to, and now, he was expected to navigate it as if it were second nature. He found himself alone for a moment, standing on the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He closed his eyes, trying to quiet the thoughts racing through his mind. What had he done? Had he made a mistake? The sound of heels clicking against the floor brought him out of his thoughts, and he turned to find Eleanor standing behind him. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. Mark hesitated, not sure how to answer. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though the words didn't feel like they matched the turmoil inside. He glanced at her, noticing the way she was looking at him, as if she were trying to read him, trying to figure him out. For the first time, he realized that she might be just as uncertain about this as he was. Eleanor smiled slightly, the faintest trace of something warmer in her eyes. "It's just a wedding, Mark. Don't overthink it. We'll get through this." Mark nodded, but something inside him shifted. He had agreed to this, yes, but as he looked at Eleanor, this woman who had been so sure, so confident, realized that this wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the contract, the marriage, or the business deal. There was something deeper here, something unspoken that neither of them had addressed. The night went on, and they played their parts, laughing, talking, posing for photos. But as the evening wound down and the last of the guests began to leave, Mark found himself once again standing on the balcony, alone, his mind swirling with questions. Was this really how it was going to be? A marriage of convenience? Or was there more to it than that? He turned to go back inside when Eleanor appeared again, standing in the doorway. Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment, there was no business deal, no partnership, just two people standing in the silence of their own thoughts. "Mark," she said, her voice steady. "I know this isn't easy. But we'll figure it out. We have to. Together." Mark didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he believed her or if this was just another part of the act. But as he stood there, looking at her, something in him softened. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't all about the deal. Maybe, it was about finding something real. Weeks passed since the wedding, and Mark found himself settling into a life that still felt unfamiliar. The luxury, the events, the constant presence of Eleanor, it all seemed so far removed from the life he had known. Yet, as much as he tried to keep a distance, something was changing. There were moments, fleeting but real, when he felt the tiniest spark of something genuine between them. The business meetings were frequent, and Mark was quickly introduced to the intricate web of Eleanor's world. She guided him through it with an unwavering hand, but always from a distance. Their marriage remained a transaction, each of them playing their part. Mark attended events, met important people, and learned how to carry himself in a world where appearance was everything. But when the doors closed at night, they were still two strangers under the same roof. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Mark returned home late, exhausted. The house was quiet, too quiet. He walked through the grand foyer, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors, and into the study where Eleanor was sitting at her desk, her back to him as she scrolled through documents. "You're home late," she said without looking up. Her voice was calm, but there was a tightness in the air between them, a tension that hadn't been there before. Mark stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, a long day." He took a step forward, his eyes falling on the papers in front of her. "You're still working?" "Always," Eleanor replied, finally looking up. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Mark noticed something different in her expression. There was a softness there, something that was almost vulnerable. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about this marriage." Eleanor didn't flinch, but there was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe. She set the papers aside and motioned for him to sit. "What about it?" Mark took a seat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "I don't know. I signed that contract, but I don't feel like I know who you really are. I'm starting to wonder if this was ever going to be real. If it's even possible for us to be anything more than a business arrangement." There was a long pause. Eleanor's face remained calm, but her gaze softened. She exhaled slowly and sat back in her chair, her hands folding in her lap. "Mark," she said quietly, "this wasn't meant to be easy. But you knew what you were signing up for. And so did I." "I know," he replied, his voice low. "But it's just. I can't keep pretending that this isn't affecting me. I thought it was all just a deal. A way out. But now, I'm not so sure." There was a silence that stretched between them, thick and heavy. Eleanor leaned forward, her fingers gently tapping the surface of the desk. "I never expected to find love in this, Mark, but maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can still find something real." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? Before he could respond, Eleanor stood up and walked over to the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the city lights outside. "I've spent my life building this empire, Mark. I never had time for anything else. But now, I wonder if I've been building the wrong thing. Maybe I've been too focused on the business, on appearances. Maybe I've been missing something." Mark followed her, standing behind her as they both gazed out at the city. "What are you saying?" he asked softly. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm saying that maybe we don't have to be perfect. Maybe we don't have to pretend that this marriage is just a business deal. Maybe, for once, we can be something real." Mark's chest tightened. He had never imagined that this marriage, this partnership, could ever lead to something more. And yet, as he stood there, looking into Eleanor's eyes, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find something real together. For the first time since their wedding, Mark wondered if he had been wrong all along. Perhaps this wasn't just a contract after all. Perhaps, deep down, they both had been searching for the same thing. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Mark found himself grappling with the changes that had begun to settle in. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, but they felt like a distant memory now, slipping further away each day. He had agreed to this marriage out of necessity, and yet, as their time together continued, he began to realize that perhaps it wasn't as simple as just a contract. Slowly but surely, he had started to see Eleanor in a new light. She wasn't just the powerful woman who had made a business arrangement with him, she was also someone who had quietly shown him kindness, who had shared parts of herself that he hadn't expected. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Eleanor placed her wine glass down and looked across at Mark, her gaze soft but intense. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, yet there was a vulnerability to it that surprised him. "I've been thinking a lot about what we've built, about this partnership. It's not just about what we can give to each other, it's about what we can build together, as equals. And I think I want to make sure you're truly a part of it. Not just as my husband, but as my partner in this." Mark looked at her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. For the first time, he realized how much of her heart she had invested in this marriage. It wasn't just a deal to her, either. She had been trying to make the impossible work, just as he had. He took a deep breath. "I don't know what this means yet. But I'm willing to try. I want to be a part of it, Eleanor. I want to be someone you can trust, someone who is with you, not just for the convenience." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her glass. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, of both of them realizing that their journey together was just beginning. The next few days were quieter. Eleanor and Mark began spending more time together outside of work and the constant social obligations. They went for walks in the park, shared dinners that weren't about appearances or business. They began to learn about each other, little by little, and Mark couldn't help but notice the way Eleanor looked at him now. It was different, warmer, like she was finally seeing him as more than just the man who had signed the marriage contract. One afternoon, they were sitting in the garden, surrounded by the soft hum of nature. The air was warm, the sunlight filtering through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt at peace. "I never thought I'd feel this way," Eleanor admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I always thought I could do it all on my own. That I didn't need anyone. But with you, Mark, I don't feel so alone anymore." Mark looked at her, his heart aching at the raw honesty in her words. He had always thought of her as this untouchable, powerful figure, someone who didn't need anyone's help, someone who was always in control. But now, as he looked at her, he saw someone who had been carrying the weight of her world on her shoulders, someone who had been afraid to let anyone in. He reached out, gently taking her hand. "You don't have to do it all alone, Eleanor. I'm here. I'm with you, for everything, not just because of the contract, but because I want to be." Eleanor's eyes glistened for a brief moment, and she squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That's all I've ever wanted, to not be alone in this." It was in that moment, sitting in the quiet of the garden, that Mark realized how much he had changed. He had come into this marriage thinking it was just a way to escape his problems, but now, he saw that it was so much more than that. It was a chance to build something real, something lasting. With Eleanor. Maybe, just maybe, this marriage could turn into a partnership in every sense of the word. As the evening approached, the last of the sunlight slipping behind the horizon, Mark felt a sense of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And he wasn't doing it alone. The days that followed were a delicate dance of quiet understanding and new challenges. Mark and Eleanor settled into a rhythm that was still unfamiliar, but slowly, they found a way to make it work. They were no longer just business partners or strangers pretending to be in a marriage, they were something else. Something more. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, their world was shaken by a sudden, unexpected event. It was a typical Tuesday morning when Mark received the call. The voice on the other end was firm, urgent. Mr. Davis, we need to talk. There's been an issue with the contract you signed. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from Eleanor's legal team again. They had already finalized everything, or so he thought. What do you mean? He asked, his voice steady but his mind racing. There's been a discrepancy. The terms of the agreement you entered into may not be as airtight as we believed. We need to go over some details immediately. He could feel his stomach tighten. He glanced at Eleanor, who was sitting across from him in the breakfast nook, reading over some documents. Her expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of worry, though she tried to hide it. I'll be right there, Mark said, his voice filled with unease. He hung up the phone and quickly stood up, pacing for a moment. This was the last thing they needed. Everything was starting to feel stable, and now this. Is something wrong? Eleanor asked, her gaze lifting from the papers. Mark paused. He didn't want to alarm her, but he couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. There's been a problem with the contract, he said simply. They're asking me to come in right away to sort it out. Eleanor set down her documents and stood up, walking over to him. I don't like the sound of this, she said, her tone steady but filled with concern. Mark could feel the weight of her gaze, her worry mirrored in his own. This wasn't just about the contract Anna Marie, it was about their future, about everything they had worked toward in the past few months. He didn't want to drag her into this, but there was no avoiding it. I'll go handle it, Mark said, trying to reassure her, but even he wasn't sure if he believed the words. Later that day, as Mark sat in the conference room, surrounded by lawyers and advisors, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The room was filled with tension as they sifted through the legal language of the agreement, pointing out errors and loopholes. For the first time since the wedding, Mark felt completely out of his depth. This could cost us everything, Mr. Davis, one of the lawyers said, his voice low and serious. Mark's mind raced as the words sunk in. Could they really lose everything? Was this marriage, this new life, all about to come crashing down? He felt a surge of panic, his chest tightening with the weight of the situation. Back at the house, Eleanor was waiting. Her face was calm, but there was a nervous energy in the air between them. Mark didn't know what to say. He didn't want to drag her into the mess, but it wasn't something they could ignore. When he entered the living room, Eleanor immediately stood up, her eyes searching his face for any sign of what had happened. Mark, she asked softly, her voice trembling with the question she had been holding back all afternoon. Mark ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his nerves. There's a problem with the contract, he said finally. They've found discrepancies, and it could cost us the whole thing. Eleanor was silent for a moment, processing his words. Then she took a deep breath and walked toward him, her eyes steady, unflinching. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. We always do. Mark looked at her, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. She was right. No matter how big the challenge, they would face it together. This wasn't just about the contract Anna Marie, it was about their partnership, their commitment to each other. Together, Mark repeated, his voice softer now, filled with something more than just resolve. It was trust. It was faith. They didn't know what would come next, but they knew one thing for sure: they were in this together, no matter what. The following days were filled with tension as Mark and Eleanor worked tirelessly to resolve the issues surrounding the contract. Mark could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every phone call, every meeting, was a reminder of how fragile everything they had built together was. The lawyers had uncovered several discrepancies that threatened to undo everything they had worked for, and it seemed like they were facing an uphill battle. Despite the mounting pressure, Eleanor remained calm, her focus unwavering. She spent hours on the phone with her legal team, while Mark followed up with the necessary parties to make sure they didn't miss any detail. It wasn't just about the money now, it was about proving that they could overcome anything together. One evening, after another long day of tense discussions and paperwork, Mark and Eleanor finally sat down together, exhausted but still determined. They were in the study again, the room filled with the quiet hum of the evening, as they stared at the papers scattered across the desk. Mark looked at Eleanor, his eyes tired but resolute. "We've been through worse," he said, his voice steady. "We can fix this. I know we can." Eleanor met his gaze, and for a moment, Mark saw something different in her eyes, something softer. It was as if, in this moment, she was no longer just the woman who had arranged this marriage, but someone who had truly become a partner in every sense of the word. She nodded slowly. "You're right. We've made it this far. There's no reason we can't get through this too." Her voice was calm, but there was a fire behind her words that Mark hadn't noticed before. For the first time, Mark felt that maybe, just maybe, their relationship was beginning to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. What started as a business arrangement was evolving into something deeper, something real. It was no longer about survival, but about building a life they both wanted to fight for. The next day, Eleanor received a call from her lawyer with good news. The issues with the contract were being resolved, and the discrepancies, while serious, could be corrected without losing everything. The relief that washed over them both was palpable, and for the first time in weeks, Mark allowed himself to breathe. Later that evening, after dinner, Mark and Eleanor sat on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below them. The air was cool, and the silence between them was comfortable, almost peaceful. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," Mark said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "I know this marriage started out as a deal, but it's turned into something more. Something real." Eleanor turned to him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lights. "I never imagined I'd be sitting here like this," she said softly. "But you've surprised me, Mark. In a good way." Mark smiled, a feeling of warmth spreading through him. "You've surprised me too," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd find something like this. Not in a million years." They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. It wasn't over yet, there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, Mark felt certain that they could face whatever came their way. Together. As the evening came to a close, Eleanor turned to him and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made Mark's heart skip a beat. "We'll get through this," she said softly. "And we'll do it together." Mark nodded, a feeling of hope flooding through him. "Together," he repeated, knowing that no matter what happened next, they were stronger than they had ever been. Weeks passed, and the storms surrounding their business deal began to settle. Eleanor and Mark had managed to navigate the legal challenges, and their lives slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though nothing about it felt the same as before. Mark found himself looking at Eleanor differently. They were no longer just partners in name, they were partners in life, each learning to rely on the other in ways they hadn't anticipated. Their days were filled with the usual hustle, but there were now quiet moments between them that spoke volumes. Their marriage, which had once felt like a transaction, had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was about trust, respect, and understanding. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Mark and Eleanor sat down for dinner together in their private dining room. The conversation flowed easily, a mix of business updates and personal stories. For the first time, it felt like they were truly getting to know each other, not just as a husband and wife in a marriage of convenience, but as two people who had built something together. "You know," Mark said, his voice thoughtful, "I never imagined we'd end up here, like this. I thought this whole thing would just be a way to get by, a way to solve problems. But now, it feels different." Eleanor looked up from her plate, her eyes meeting his. "I know what you mean. When we first started this, I thought I was doing it for the legacy, for security. But now, I can't deny that this marriage means something more to me too." Mark smiled, his heart warming. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we did this. I'm glad we took the chance." Eleanor returned his smile, her eyes soft with a warmth Mark hadn't seen before. "Me too," she said simply. The evening wore on, and as they sat together, the quiet comfort of their shared space filled the room. They didn't need grand gestures or elaborate declarations. They had built a life together, one based on mutual understanding, patience, and the willingness to face whatever came their way. Later that night, after dinner, they found themselves standing together on the balcony once more, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Mark wrapped his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, pulling her close. The night air was cool, but the warmth between them was undeniable. "You were right," Mark said, his voice soft. "This marriage, it's not what I thought it would be. It's more." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, her breath steady and calm. "I'm glad you see that," she whispered. In that moment, Mark realized how much they had both grown. What started as a contract had turned into something he hadn't thought possible, something real. He had entered this marriage expecting to escape his past, but now, it wasn't just about escaping. It was about building a future together. And for the first time, Mark felt at peace, knowing that whatever challenges life threw their way, they would face them side by side, partners in every sense of the word. As the night stretched on, Mark kissed Eleanor's forehead, a promise of the life they had ahead of them. Together, he said quietly, knowing that this was only the beginning.